Hello friends, I'm Aisling and today we're talking books to read for Pride Month. Firstly, happy Pride. Secondly, sorry this is a little bit late, but we're basically talking books that were either mostly written by queer authors, have like queer themes, have queer characters. Some of them weren't written by queer authors but have really great queer representation, and I have tried to keep it kind of quite varied in terms of genres. So without further ado, we're going to get cracking, and the first book that I'm going to speak about is technically a sci-fi. It's like a cozy sci-fi and it is so lovely, and that book is A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. It's a really short book. It is part of a duology, I believe, and I haven't actually read the second book yet, but I loved this. It's like a cozy sci-fi. So we're set in a world where centuries beforehand robots used to do kind of all the manual labor, and one day they just decided no. And they put down their shovels, they put down their pickaxes, they put down their tools, and off they went into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Until. So our story follows a tea monk, and this is kind of great because there is a monk in a monastery and they decide that they want to be a tea monk. And what a tea monk is, they go from town to town and place to place, and what they do essentially is they speak to people about their woes. They help the people in the places that they visit to kind of come to terms with certain situations that they're dealing with, and essentially what you would call like a cozy counsellor. It seems like the loveliest idea, and I wish it was a real thing. The life of our tea monk is upended when they decide to go off on a trip and they actually meet a robot. And this robot is desperate to find out the answer to the question, what do people need? Bit of a heavy-handed, bit of a loaded question, but this is what our robot wants to do. So this book has really great queer representation. So our main character is a monk, and rather than being called like brother or sister, they are called sibling, which is really nice. It's sort of a facet of our main character without being like the full main topic of the story, which is nice because non-binary people exist in society as a whole and they're just trying to live their lives just as the rest of us are. The world was really accepting of this, and it was just so nice to see. This book deals a lot with like, in a world where having so much, do we need more? Does having more actually matter? It deals so much with like purpose and identity and nature and productivity, and to some degree capitalism as well, all in this teeny tiny little book. But it's so good, it's so cute, it's so cozy, and I'm really looking forward to reading the next book in this series. Next up then is a book that I don't actually have a physical copy of, but I need to rectify that because this was one of my favourite books of 2024, and this is Julia Armfield's novel Our Wives Under the Sea. So we follow Mary and Leah. They're a married couple, and Leah goes off on a deep sea mission that was supposed to take a few weeks but ended up taking a number of months. Nobody really knew what was going on with the mission. Everybody kind of assumed them to be dead. But then Leah returns. But she returns kind of profoundly changed. There's something inherently very different about her. We see the couple trying to navigate life under this new sort of framework, and in a way they kind of have to learn to get to know each other again. And it is a story about falling in love, but it's also a story about loss, and it's a story about grief. I find this book really difficult to recommend because I feel like when I talk about it I don't really hit what I need to hit, and that's because I can't find the words for this book. It is beautiful, it's literary. Some of the writing is incredibly poetic. If you've ever read Julia Armfield, you'll understand her writing is so good. This book is classed as a horror, but if you're not a horror reader, I'm not really a horror reader. It's not like scary, it's not jump scare, it's not gonna frighten the life out of you, but it is gonna make you feel a little bit uneasy, and there is a bit of body horror in here. So if that's something that you're not into, maybe skip this one. It is very readable, it's just very uncomfortable at times. It is so atmospheric, it is so good. It's incredibly haunting. It really delves into their relationship and it feels really melancholic in a way, and if you know me, I love a melancholic book. The prose is beautiful. And I was so surprised by this one. I was sick when I read it last year and I just wanted something short and kind of easy and maybe forgettable, and I did get short and I did to some degree get easy, but this book is not forgettable. It is beautiful and I fully recommend reading this book. I fully recommend reading Julia Armfield in general anyway. Next up then is another favourite book of mine, and this one is a favourite book of all time. Probably the number one favourite book of all time. And I'm not going to leave you in suspense. That book is Tin Man by Sarah Winman. If you're around here a while, you will definitely have witnessed me gushing about this book. So it's another quite short one. This is by far the novel that I have gifted to other people more than any other novel. I think I've bought about 7-8 copies of this book by this point. I own 2 myself. So the tagline of this book is that this is almost a love story, and I feel like that absolutely encompasses this book. There's a little blurb on the front and it's Matt Haig, and he says it's dripping with tenderness, and he's not wrong. If you don't like Matt Haig, don't let that put you off because this book is beautiful. So we follow 2 boys, Ellis and Michael, and they meet as young boys in Oxford at the age of 12, and they spend their lives together learning how to exist in a world that seems almost too harsh to be bearable. And so then we fast forward in time and Michael is nowhere to be seen. Relationships are absolutely the focus of this story, and Sarah Winman is unbelievably adept at writing about the ease and difficulties of our connections with others. I fully recommend all of her books, literally every one. She has 4 novels at the moment and I hope she never stops writing because they're absolutely stunning. It's a really quiet, poetic novel. It's incredibly literary. The language is at points really simple but also incredibly profound. It is quite short, but within these few pages we read and feel so heavily the quietness and sadness of ordinary life. Just a heads up, there are no quotation marks in this book in terms of the conversations and the dialogue, and I know some people really hate that. I honestly didn't notice it when I was reading. I read this book in one sitting, and I will say if that's a red flag of yours, maybe skip it, but I just think it would be an awful shame to skip this book. It's so lovely. I genuinely believe that this is a pretty perfect novel, and I'll fight you on that, genuinely. Next up then is a historical fiction novel, and that is The Night Watch by Sarah Waters. Also another author that I'm just going to say, read all of her books. I haven't quite read them all yet, but I'm just going to say they're very good. She's a really great author. If you like historical fiction and you like to be a little bit sad, Sarah Waters is your woman. So this one follows 4 Londoners in the 1940s. And my cat is having a conniption outside my door. But this book has an unusual quirk, so it is written in reverse chronological order. So we start out the book at the end of the story and then we work our way backwards and we are told how we have gotten there. And it sounds a bit gimmicky, but it works really well. So as I've mentioned, we follow multiple points of view. There is Kay, who is an ambulance driver during the war, and then we have Helen, and she's really lovely and sweet, but she harbours a really difficult secret. And we also follow Viv, who's like this incredibly glamorous girl, but she's almost a bit too loyal to her soldier boyfriend. And then last but certainly not least, we have Duncan, who has had his own demons to fight during the war. Their lives sometimes connect in really incredible and surprising and satisfying ways, and we witness each of them grappling with the consequences of war and the politics and the economy of the time. It's an incredibly tender, poignant, poetic novel, but it is also really tragic, and it feels massive in its scale but also really tiny in its ordinariness, and I mean that in the best way possible. I won't say too much more about this book. I'll leave you to find out more about it yourself, but if you love sad historical novels that are as much about the characters as they are the plot, then this one is for you. Next up then, like, how can you have a list of books for Pride without including Mr. James Baldwin? So the next book I'm going to recommend is Giovanni's Room. Maybe very expected in some ways, but I just can't overlook it. So this was a book that I was very aware of for a very long time, as I'm sure most of you here are well aware of it. If you haven't read it, I'd say a lot of you have. I just knew that this would be a book that I would one day eventually read, so I just put it off for a really long time, and then last year I was kind of like, I think it's time. And it should have been time a long time before that. The first thing that struck me about this novel, so this was my first James Baldwin novel, and the writing is exquisite. Unsurprisingly, my kind of two main interactions that I'd had with James Baldwin before this were I had watched the movie of If Beale Street Could Talk, but I hadn't read the book yet. And also on Instagram, I feel like I just see James Baldwin quotes all the time, and I find myself like nodding my head, like agreeing, but also being like, how do you do that with words? Because yeah, wow. So I genuinely thought that I knew what this novel was going to be about. I thought I could tell you the plot even before I read it, and I will let you know now that I was very wrong. I made a lot of assumptions about it, and those assumptions were wrong. So I don't want to give away too much or anything at all, really, because this book is also incredibly short. It's only about 150 pages, but I will say this, it was a book that was actually quite a lot darker than I was expecting, and it's quite heart-wrenching, but not in the way that I thought that it would be. So many of the characters are incredibly morally grey, which of course makes them feel really real, because I don't think any of us are fully perfect. We might have the best of intentions, but unfortunately sometimes our actions don't really follow through, do they? We're all human and we're all out here trying our best. As classics go, I think this one was written in about 1956, so it does feel relatively contemporary. The writing is very accessible, so if you're somebody that's a little bit nervous of reading classics, absolutely don't be. This book is very accessible, very readable, very good. Very much a recommendation on this list. Next up then is a book that is a recent reread for me. So I only just made a reading vlog, which you can find, I never know what way to point. This way, I think. Up here, I'll link it anyway. So this book is On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous by the lovely Ocean Vuong. So this is Ocean Vuong's first novel. He is first and foremost a poet, and you can tell when you read this book. The language in here is just impeccably beautiful, and I don't know how somebody does with words what Ocean Vuong does. So this book follows the perspective of a young Vietnamese man who has grown up as an immigrant in America with his mother and his grandmother. His mom is also obviously Vietnamese, but she comes to America and she doesn't really have the language, and she never learns to write. So her son, our protagonist, decides to write a letter to her, which he knows will probably never actually be read. This is a letter that unearths his and his family's history, which began in Vietnam. Vuong's writing is lyrical, it is tender, and it is much about the language that he uses as it is about the plot or the characters. While there is a plot for the most part, this novel is absolutely character driven. If you think you're getting an epistolary novel, it's not quite written in letter format, let me tell you. At times the format can be really unconventional, veering into the realm of Vuong's poetry. If you've read his poetry, you will recognise it in this. It's a novel about survival and joy and about wielding your own power. It's an absolutely stunning read, and as I said, I only just finished a reread of this book, and the first time that I read it, I gave it 3 stars. Like an idiot. I don't know what was wrong with me at the time. I read it in 2021, and I think I was definitely looking for a very plot-driven novel. So if you're like me and you're looking for a plot-driven novel, this is not the book to pick up. You want to pick this book up when you kind of want to be a little bit heartbroken and you want to be just in awe of somebody's writing. It is a beautiful, heart-wrenching and stunning book, and if you know me, I don't give 5 stars very often, but this one has absolutely inched its way up into a 5-star rating. Absolutely no regrets. Next up then, we're talking a young adult fantasy, and it is a trilogy, but the first 2 books are published presently, and the next book I believe is coming in 2025, I think. All that aside, the book I'm talking about is Legendborn by Tracy Deonn, and then the second book is Bloodmarked, and I'm recommending both of those books and potentially the third book as well. So this book is, as I've mentioned, a young adult fantasy, and we follow Bree Matthews, who is a black teenager who's grown up in the southern states of America. So she does well in school and aces some pre-college exams and ends up getting to go to pre-college with her friend Alice. Bree's mother has quite recently died in a road accident, and we find Bree grappling very heavily with her grief, and I found it done really well, especially and particularly for a young adult novel where you don't quite expect that kind of depth, but I thought it was done really well. So on their first night there, Bree and Alice go to a party and they witness something that maybe they potentially shouldn't, but somebody wipes their memory, only Bree's memory doesn't get wiped. It doesn't work for some reason. As a consequence of going to this party and being bad girls, they both get kind of assigned like babysitters or mentors to kind of look after them. Alice is particularly angry with Bree because she doesn't normally do things like that, and now she's in trouble and it's only like her first day. So Bree is with her mentor Nick when another magical attack occurs, and she gets hurt, but she also gets healed and her memory is yet again wiped. But she still remembers, and also starts to remember something from the night that her mother died. And she realises that she actually has links to the Legendborn, and her memory has actually been wiped before. She tries to infiltrate the Legendborn with her mentor's help and wants to find out exactly what happened to her mother because she doesn't believe it's an accident anymore. This book shows us how racism infiltrates everything. It's full of microaggressions, and it really opened my eyes as a white person in terms of just the things that I don't notice, the privileges that I have because I'm a white person and I've grown up in a white body. There's a lot of talk of slavery in here. It's not like Tracy Deonn is preaching. It's done really well. It's fitted into the story really well. And the reason that I've included this book on this list is because there's some really great queer representation. There are non-binary characters, there are gay characters, there are bisexual characters, and it's just done incredibly well. And it was such a good, fast-paced read. I only read this last year as an adult. If you're into young adult fantasy, but even if you're not, if you're willing to kind of suspend your preconceived notions about young adult fantasy, I would recommend picking this one up. Devon challenges the racist structures that have been overlooked within culture and crafts a world that works to deconstruct them. There's some really great magic systems in here, two kind of opposing magic systems. One of them deals really heavily with the natural world, and I loved that. It was just such a good read, really surprising. I wasn't expecting much from it, but I absolutely loved it. So that is Legendborn. Next up then is another book that I unfortunately don't have a physical copy of, but the book in question is The Death of Vivek Obi by Akwaeke Emezi. So this book, oh my word. We start out with a mother opening her front door to find her dead son out on the veranda. She doesn't know how he got there, she doesn't know what happened, and naturally she is absolutely grief struck. This story is very much about a man who has an overprotective mother but also a really distant father, and it's so much about a family trying to understand their child, trying to love their child when they just don't get him. So we follow a lot characters whose lives have been shaped by Vivek, who is the man who was found dead on the veranda. This book is set in Nigeria and it speaks about Vivek's Nigerian childhood. It speaks about his relationships with his family and with his friends. It is beautifully written, beautifully crafted, really unusual. We are reading a lot from the perspective of the dead man from Vivek Obi, and I cared so deeply for these characters. And it's one of those books that just kind of sits with you. And I remember listening to this on really long walks in nature and really feeling it and just being very glad that there was nobody around me. Maybe a tear or two might have been shed. Who knows? Nobody else was there. We'll never know. And next up then we have an equally kind of unconventional novel, and that is Briefly a Delicious Life by Nell Stevens. So this one is a novel that centres an unconventional family who moved to Majorca in 1838. They've essentially arrived in the pursuit of wellness and find themselves living in an old monastery that just so happens to be haunted by our protagonist Blanca. So Blanca is the ghost of a teenage girl who was once enamoured with beautiful men, but who in death has allowed her focus to fall on beautiful women instead. Can't blame her. The mother of this family is called George, and she is a woman who dresses in men's clothes, and Blanca becomes absolutely obsessed with her. George smokes cigars, she writes books, she does things that are very unconventional for women in the time. Blanca immediately loves her and follows George and her family, and she looks after them, travelling both with and inside of them, so that she too can feel the sensations that come with having a body that she so dearly misses and can't remember, and she's just basically almost forgotten in her hundreds of years of being a ghost. So Stephen's stark and direct prose is really beautiful. It delivers such an unusual story with the ease of a much more experienced author. I believe this to be a debut. After the first few chapters I had stopped to reread paragraphs again. Not something I necessarily always do. This is, I will say, primarily a character driven novel, but naturally there is some sort of a plot, and sometimes the pacing seems a little bit off or unusual, but it's a book that I've thought about often since I read it, and I think it's very deserving of a place on this list. And then finally, last but not least at all, is a book that blew my mind in the best way possible. So I'm speaking about This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El Mortar and Max Gladstone. So this is, I believe, a collaboration, which is quite unusual in and of itself. How do you explain this one? So it is another sci-fi novel, and it is essentially a love story. So it's like a literary sci-fi romance, but that doesn't sound to me like it does it justice. So this is like an epic love story which spans space and time. We witness a correspondence between two agents who are both hell-bent on securing the best outcome for each of their warring factions. So the discovery of said correspondence would absolutely result in either one or both of their deaths. This is a sci-fi book, and I will say the first half of this book I was a bit like, what's going on here? I wanted a lot more information. So the world building is quite lax, but I believe that to be very intentional, and I actually had to Google, like, do we get these answers or what's the story? And we don't. Don't go into this looking for a book that ties up all the loose ends, that tells you everything you need to know, because a lot of this book is left for you to kind of figure out, to mull over, to sort through yourself. And I believe that to work really well, but I can understand why a lot of people might think that that's a bit gimmicky or just might not like it at all. But once I got to that point where I was accepting of, okay, this is what it is, this is what I'm getting, I really kind of softened into it, and I really began to just love it. We just don't get the world building that we're used to getting, and I mean, it is there, but it's not what we might be used to with other books in similar genres. So I don't know, I don't know how to explain this one, and I don't want to give too much away, but I will say that this book is truly original and just utterly beautiful. Beautiful, like phenomenal. It's going to be very polarizing, and some of you are going to read it and be like, why did she recommend that book? But then there are going to be plenty of you out there that just would maybe have never picked up this book, and I just really think more people should pick up this book. Beautiful, just chef's kiss, like what a book. So that's that. I hope you find something in here that might tickle your fancy a little bit. Of course, I'm going to say happy Pride. I hope you're all having a lovely month, and I hope that lots of the homophobes and transphobes out there are feeling really uncomfortable, as they should be. Pride Month is great, but do keep your eye out for corporations who decide to put the rainbow on their logos because they think it will make their company look good, while actively not contributing any money to LGBTQ plus charities, or actively not making their workplaces comfortable for each and every identity, as we all should be doing. It just really grinds my gears, because 10 years ago none of these corporations were bothered with Pride until, oh look, it's gonna sell stuff for us. Go away. Thank you so much as ever for watching. Don't forget to give me a subscribe if you want to see a bit more from me, and I hope you're minding yourself, and I hope you're taking care. Otherwise, I'll see you next week for another one. Bye bye.